This is KZSC 88.1 FM, kzsc.org. My name is John Malkin, and this is Transformation Highway. Today you'll hear an interview with Gina Dent, Professor of Feminist Studies and History of Consciousness here at the University of California at Santa Cruz. Gina Dent and Angela Davis recently kicked off a year-long series of online events focused on prison abolition called Visualizing Abolition. For more information, check out the website for the Institute of Arts and Sciences at UCSC. Here now is Gina Dent. So we are, I guess, about 9 months into this pandemic that has really turned everyone's worlds upside down in a lot of ways. I suppose I thought, in March, maybe wars that were going on would stop. People would have more pressing needs in dealing with food and water and staying healthy. But things like that actually have continued. It's been a little disheartening. In the meantime, also, we have continued to see videos of a lot of Black people being harmed or killed by the police. George Floyd being one of them. And it's led to this pretty huge outpouring sentiment of really wanting to change policing. And the terms defund and abolish are being cried out by more people than I've ever heard. And I've been part of police accountability activism for a long time. And it's heartening to see that. And you have been, as you said, working on abolition for quite a while. Would you just explain a little bit about what you mean by abolition? And I know that you're referring to the institution and structure of policing and prisons, but just tell people what abolition means to you now.
Yeah. Well, when you add now to the end of that question, it does reshape my answer because, as you pointed out, this is a different kind of moment than the moment many of us were engaged in this activism in the early part of the 2000s. And it is exciting for that reason. And it is also really important for us to pay close attention to the language we use, the ideas we're putting forward, the ways we're relating to each other as we do that, because we are in a time of reform. And I'm going to call it that because I'm going to distinguish between abolition and criminal justice reform. Abolitionists are focused on getting us to a world where we do not have prisons. And the reason we do not have prisons is because we no longer need prisons. And in order not to need prisons, we have to resolve all of the social problems and issues that the prison purports to solve. Now, scholars, and it really doesn't matter what side of the spectrum, all agree that the prison does not do what it promises it will do. It does not keep communities safe. It does not rehabilitate. It does not educate. It does not decrease violence. It actually exacerbates so many of the problems that we already have. The problem, I think, is that even though many people understand this, they either understand it from their personal lives, or they understand it because of things they've read and watched, or they understand it because of the activism that they're seeing or participating in now, they don't necessarily know what alternatives we have. They imagine that even though the prison system is bad, it's the only thing we can do because we have so much unfortunate crime. So abolitionists are focused on reframing the conversation so that we can move away from the language of law and order and of crime control and toward a language which focuses on how we have used and conceived of punishment. Because punishment is often the part we don't see. So even today, when we are able now to have videos of what has happened in the streets, what has happened as a result of violence at the hands of police officers, we still do not have very much that we can witness about what goes on inside of prisons. And of course, I think many of us would argue that that's intentional. Jails and prisons used to actually occupy spaces closer to where most of us live. But over time, they have been moved further and further away from visibility. And all of that makes the job of thinking about how to rid ourselves of prisons even more difficult. But as you said, this is also an exciting time. It's a time when people are thinking about redistributing our resources, investing in the kinds of structures that could actually get us to a world that doesn't have prisons. And on the way to that world, prison abolitionists try to sort out the difference between those kinds of changes or reforms that can make things truly better and that are taking us on the road toward abolition, and those kinds of reforms or changes that will actually serve to further bolster the prison system.
There's a very good video of you with Angela Davis that was taped in January, on January 16th of this year. It may have been, I'm imagining, the last big in-person event you all did. I don't know. But it's a great, it's a great discussion, and a few things really impacted me when I watched this. One is relating to what you're talking about, the difference between reform and revolution, or really getting rid of prisons. Angela and yourself are referring to Michel Foucault, who apparently, this is really a doozy, I think. He was saying that the very history of prisons is the history of reforms of the prison institution, and those reforms have always served to strengthen and render more permanent the prison system.
Yeah, prison itself is a reform away from carceral punishment, the kind of punishment that would be doled out by the state or state actors that would result in physical harms that are of the more obvious kind. I say that because I think we know now that prisons continue to dole out physical harms, but the reform that Foucault is pointing to is the reform of developing the idea of prison itself, a space where humans are sequestered away from those that are supposed to be protected, and where they will ostensibly be able to become rehabilitated. And of course, because for Foucault, he was both engaged in thinking about the structures of violence and also the structures of the subject, he was deeply interested in the issue of prisons for that reason.
I am curious how the abolition movement can move forward and make some substantial changes and move toward exactly what you're saying, creating new systems that actually serve the health and well-being of people and get rid of these systems of punishment, of policing and prisons. And one fundamental thing I've been thinking about, a lot of cities, people all over the world are now talking about this.
Yes.
How can we replace a portion of our police with mental health workers, crisis workers, EMTs? This organization in Eugene, Oregon, Cahoots, they have been answering about 20% of the emergency 911 calls for 30 years there without police. They're training people all over the country to do that. The city of Santa Cruz is sort of looking at that. I would say, what I'm curious about is if we replace 20% of the calls with that kind of group, and maybe 50% of the calls have to do with homelessness, if we house people and have, comfortable living for everyone and have health care, physical and mental health care for everyone, that will eliminate those calls. My question is, what of policing is worth saving?
Well, I think none of it. And let's talk about why. The foundations of policing are in slavery. There are really interesting histories of policing that have been written, and this is not my expertise, but I will say I just read Alex Vitale's The End of Policing, and that book and many others talk about the roots of policing in slave catchers and in and even the extent to which the uniforms of sheriffs and others are actually reflective of those histories. So what we call policing or consider policing today should become a relic of the past. Now, I think what people are really asking for is for a sense of security, safety, support in their community, and those things we want to try to provide. The question is, can those things be provided by policing as we've come to understand it? And I don't think they can. So you've just pointed out that great program, and I was really impressed in observing, unfortunately at a distance, what happened in Minneapolis, for example, after the killing of George Floyd. It was amazing to me that not only was the city council calling for defunding the police, but that when especially the chair of the city council was interviewed about what they would do, they had a robust set of responses about what needed to be provided. And I think that is where your question began, and that is what I hear today that is so very exciting and reveals to me something which I think those of us in the activist community weren't entirely sure of, which is how much has taken hold in the popular imagination about alternatives. And of course, we have corporate interests that are marshaled against any of these changes. And this is the reason we have to recognize the structure of what we call the prison industrial complex. It isn't just that we have people doing things that are violent and that we have people inside of prisons, that we have police, but it's also that we have so much of our capitalist and corporate environment focused on and invested in aspects of incarceration. And so figuring out what it means to actually defund, redistribute, is complicated, but it is something that local communities are doing a good job at, and we need to continue to support them. And we also need to share this knowledge, and we need to scale that knowledge up. And it's that scaling up process that we need to be engaged with now.
Yes, I agree. I'm wondering about, I think of two general strategies, and I'm probably not considering other possible strategies, but I think of two broad strategies. I'm seeing a lot of cities and activists saying if we want to abolish police and prisons, we need to appeal to current politicians and authority and ask them to fund alternative programs, some of which are good, like this program from Eugene, Oregon. I'm thinking of an alternative strategy that is more broadly used in nonviolent revolutionary movements. I think of Gandhi, who basically said to get rid of the colonial oppressors, we need to disengage with them and provide our own clothing, make your own clothes, get your own food, and then eventually that structure around us will disappear. We'll provide for our own needs. I think of the Black Panthers similarly. They didn't go to the local city council and ask for permits and funding. They said, we want to start our own schools, our own self-defense classes, and there you go. And this model has been used all over the world. I think, in other words, starting to create the systems that meet our needs and letting the old systems pass away over time. I don't know what you think about these two different strategies, and if you have ideas about what you think will be more effective long term.
Well, I think what's going to be effective long term is doing all of that. And I think most abolitionists that I know are committed to all of us working from wherever we are. And I think that is really very key. When we were organizing critical resistance back in 1998, one of the things that was important was to invite all kinds of different people who were connected to the prison-industrial complex, but not necessarily because they would maybe even be aware of that. So nurses, physicians, teachers, and artists, and others who were a part of the system, but didn't necessarily have the space to think through what the implications were of that system on them and what alternatives they had. So we need everyone to be operating from wherever they are. I will say that we want to be contributing to efforts that are not going to fortify that system. We have to have a test as to whether or not we have, as Thomas Mathieson would refer to it, a reformist or a non-reformist reform. It is terribly hard to figure out sometimes, and maybe we'll get to Prop 25 in a moment. It is terribly hard to figure out sometimes whether or not something that is proposed legislatively is going to be helpful or harmful. And part of the reason for that is that some things that look helpful on the surface actually provide resources to ostensible alternatives that are actually still part of the prison-industrial complex. They still feed the prison system and the logic of that system. So we need to be worried about that. Now, you're right to point to organizations like the Panthers and others, but I would say that we don't have to look only at the past. I'm thinking about the organization Insight, Women of Color Against Violence, that had its founding moment at the University of Santa Cruz after a conference in the early 2000s. And that organization, formed by people who had been part of the domestic violence movement, the movement to combat domestic violence for many years, but who had been worried that they were contributing to fortifying the prison-industrial complex, meant that the people who got themselves together at that conference now formed Insight and did a lot of the kind of activity that you're describing in local spaces. So there are many different groups who were doing things in their local communities, sometimes theater projects. There was a beautiful story about a group called Sister to Sister in New York there were young women who would do street theater and around domestic violence and engage people on the streets. And they would do other kinds of things to create awareness in their community and then talk through alternative solutions and then work on those solutions outside of the system itself. So yes, we absolutely need to be doing that, and we will continue with that. But we live in right now, I'm not even going to be talking about the global issues, but for right now, just even to talk about the United States, we are a big and complicated country. And to tackle this without imagining that we will have to continue to work in some ways within the system that we have, to my mind, is probably not entirely possible, which doesn't mean that I don't encourage the people who are doing that to do that, but my work is crossing between those different zones. As a university professor, I cannot entirely exempt myself from a lot of the structures that are feeding the prison-industrial complex. And so it is my role within the university to make sure that as a researcher, as a teacher, as a scholar, and as an activist, I engage with the role the university is playing. So I think living in the space where I work in the way that is consistent with my values and with what I know about prisons is really important.
Mm-hmm. It is really important. And this country is complicated, and this is a global relationship. And you have pointed out how important the role is that the United States plays in exporting prison ideas to the rest of the world. And you've visited prisons all over the world. And you've also pointed out the deeper roots of all of this in terms of capitalism and the way that wealth and power are owned, and the way that the United States has always exported what it thinks is democracy around the world, which is really anti-democracy. These are all really important aspects of abolition for sure. One thing you said that really struck me is about nonviolence and violence, and who determines who is being one of those. You said something like, it's not about just being nonviolent, but thinking critically about what gets called violence and who gets to have the label of being nonviolent. Would you say a little more about how, well, who does get to make those determinations in our culture? This is KZSC 88.1 FM. You're listening to an interview with Gina Dent.
I did mention Prop 25, and it might make sense for me to say just a little bit about that right now, in the sense that Prop 25 in California is designed to get rid of the money bail system. And that, from an abolitionist point of view, is a good thing. It means that, on its face, people who can't afford to make bail will not be serving long jail sentences, which dramatically transform their lives. But it also relies, unfortunately, on alternatives which would create risk assessments that are based on algorithms and other methods that will mark people by where they live, what they, their racial background, anything else, who they're around, and all kinds of other factors that are going to obviously discriminate and create further violences. So I'm labeling that violence because it is often difficult for us to perceive in our society where violences are existing and persisting, and often the very people who are targeted with violence are the ones that are perceived as the violent. I'll give you a kind of funny story about this, but when I was part of that research group, critical resistance research group in 2000, we, as part of our work, went into prisons in California on visits. And I believe we were at California Institution for Women. I'm not really sure, but we were inside of one of the prisons we visited. And as we were about to walk into ADSEG, which is administrative segregation or solitary confinement, the guards who were taking us around on our tour offered us bulletproof vests. And we turned to the guards and said, well, why would we need bulletproof vests? You're the only people who have guns. So it was this funny moment where we were supposed to understand that the building we were entering in as a violent space because of the people who were being imprisoned, but the violence that would have come and threatened us could only have come from guards. It's the kind of thing that makes me reflect all the time on the ways in which some are perceived without any action whatsoever on their part as violent, and others are perceived as nonviolent. I learned also in Palestine to think about this really deeply. One of the most profound conversations I had on a delegation that I went on in 2011 of Indigenous and women of color feminists was a conversation about the problem of having always to proclaim nonviolence when you were Palestinian, and how that worked constantly to support and bolster the capacity of the Israeli state to enact violence, and how it disabled the people who were suffering from that violence in their responses. So I'm always really careful to think about the category of nonviolence. As someone who is Black from the United States and an inheritor of the long civil rights movement, I'm often encouraged to describe myself as nonviolent. But that is itself a kind of trap. I think you could understand from the work I do and from the life I live that most likely I would be categorized as someone who is nonviolent, but I can tell you that I know from the stories of many people who have found themselves inside of prisons that it very quickly could be the case that someone just like me, who is Black and living in the United States, could be turned into a person with a violent history. So I'm mindful of that always.
Mm-hmm. I'm really mindful of that too, and that's been a journey. I think when I first started in activism in the 80s, I heard from so many activists and friends who were traveling to Central and South America, where the United States was bombing and aiding destruction of so many villages and people there. They'd come back and say, it's really not our place to tell those people how to respond. The notion of going there and teaching them nonviolence, once you go there and listen and pay attention, that's really not your place. What the people there suggested was, go home now and tell your people to stop bombing us. That's your role as an American. Yeah, it's a tricky and interesting matter, who defines what violence is, and then therefore who deserves punishment and what type of punishment. That's sort of one aspect of abolition that's it's a philosophical thing, but it's an emotional thing, and it's a practical thing. We all sort of are raised in this culture to believe that if someone does something to you that's harmful or takes something of yours, the best way to change their behavior is to make them suffer, and then they'll reflect on what they've done and they won't do it again. That's a wholly mistaken notion, don't you think?
I do think. I suppose generalizing about what will work to change behaviors is harder than saying that I don't think that will work. So I think what's important sometimes is to talk about the different kinds of ways we have to approach this, and all of those ways would have to be culturally sensitive and localized in some respects. I think we do better when we build those things up from the grounds and from communities such as we have it, although those categories are complicated because we are also in a society where there is a great deal of movement, not currently, but normally, and so it is difficult to think about what would work in every place or how we could hermetically seal off some communities such that whatever practices had been agreed upon could persist. So that is difficult. I mean, the problem of the state's monopoly on violence and the role that the violence of the prison plays within that structure is really important for us to understand. It's also important for us to understand, and this is back to the reference to Foucault, but also in much of the other scholarship and thinking and activism, is how much we internalize the logics of those structures. So it really requires, when doing abolitionist work, spending time with people, talking through what our own responses are when we feel violated. So what makes us feel violated, in what way we confront that, how we express it, what we expect to have done about it, because it's often a very different thing to theoretically take the perspective that we are abolitionists than to actually move through each day of our lives fulfilling that vision. And so I'm very much engaged with projects that are working at the ground level to try to get us to perceive differently and to engage differently. And I'm also very engaged in the world of creative artists, intellectuals, writers, visual artists, and others, filmmakers, who are helping us to slow down some of those moments so that we can evaluate them, take a step back, and re-enter from a place of reflection. And that is all going to take us a long, long time. People often characterize that in terms of the generations that it will take us, and it will be generational.
I appreciate you bringing up artists and musicians, filmmakers, writers as being both a creative force and a force that examines culture and in a particular way. It can be a powerful personal and collective force.
Yes. I mean, I am very engaged with artists and other creatives who are thinking beyond the prison. And for me, the reason has to do with some of the things I learned in doing some of the early activist work. When I realized that, from my perspective, the problem of incarceration is not a problem of lack of information about the wrongs of incarceration, at least from the point of view of many people on the left. Many people have had family members who've been inside, even if they have never been inside, and have knowledge of some of the harm. I think there are so many documentaries and television shows and other ways of learning about the violations. Not only the ones that are extensions beyond even being incarcerated, but meaning, being beaten or something obvious in that way, but even being separated itself as a violation. But people tended, when I was talking to groups, to understand that. They just didn't have a way of understanding how invested they were in the very system that they thought they had a critique of. What do I mean by that? When I was studying this first in the early 2000s, I was, back in the days when we had such a thing as a TV guide that was searchable online. That may exist now, but who needs it anymore? But at the time, I would search for jail, prison, crime, and if I did those searches, I would find that every hour of every day, there was something on television that was showing us the criminal justice system. And what I mean by that could be something like a cartoon or Law and Order episode, or it could be a documentary, but it could be a comedy show. It could be anything. So the fact that we never live in a space where the criminal justice system is far from our view was further consolidating our sense of it being at the center of our reality, even for those of us who were against it. So I wanted to start to think about how that vision was cemented, what visual culture itself had done to contribute to that, how we might use visual culture as a way of moving past that, and to start to think deeply about the way that the method through which we internalize some of these knowledges and ways that we might become more aware of the penetration of those knowledges so that we could begin to transform them into better, more creative, more liberatory ways of thinking.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to combine a couple of ideas and then you can respond whatever strikes you. Black Lives Matter is a huge movement now and has really inspired a lot of people. There are people who are saying, wow, I'm white. That movement leaves me out. Where does my life matter? And I want to relay to you some information about local things that are going on regarding you referred to this earlier. It's sometimes hard to know the difference between a reform and a non-reform reform. One aspect of that is co-opting of a movement. So the Santa Cruz police, in a community Zoom forum earlier this year, the police chief, Andy Mills, when he was asked about the death of Tamario Smith, a young man in the Santa Cruz County Jail who had a mental health crisis and ongoing mental health difficulties, he ended up dying in the jail here from drinking too much water. The police chief said about that, we don't run the jail. The county runs the jail. We only take people there. And I want to tell you a couple more things about the local police in terms of, wow, is this a reform or a non-reform reform? There's some cosmetic things that are happening. For example, people around the country are appealing to their city councils to have murals painted that say Black Lives Matter. I think that happened here. The words Black Lives Matter are painted on the street downtown. I sometimes cynically am thinking the police here would gladly have abolished the police painted on the street in front of the police department if they could continue their policing as usual. The police chief here sort of became famous when he kneeled at a Black Lives Matter protest downtown in Santa Cruz next to the black mayor of Santa Cruz. Roughly around the same time, he sent Santa Cruz police officers to Oakland to face off against Black Lives Matter protesters there. The police chief here also wears an All Lives Matter bracelet while he's chanting Black Lives Matter. I'm just wondering what you think about this co-opting or the, determining the difference between a reform and a non-reform reform.
Well, thank you for talking about, first of all, Tamario Smith and his death. It is, suffice it to say, we know which kinds of populations are more vulnerable to being incarcerated in the first place, and we also know which kinds of populations are more vulnerable to suffering egregiously beyond the norm inside of prison. So this is a story that we'll need to hold on to. I have to say that as an activist for basically my life, I don't spend too much time worrying about what's being co-opted. It's far more effective to continue to do the work that I can do and to try and support others doing work that I feel that I can understand. Getting distracted by who's kneeling and who's not kneeling is really not something that I feel is helpful for me. Over individualizing our narratives, which is one of our habits, and we're both talking about Tamario Smith, and we're also talking about the police chief, and we do that because it allows us to say something larger from each of those stories, but one of those individual stories might be helpful for us to draw out because it will otherwise be disappeared, and the other story might be something that we want to let die as a story. So I feel like we have to be careful when we're sorting through what we're seeing in this moment, and also trying to make sense of others' behaviors. I mean, as an abolitionist, I spend a lot of time talking with people. As you said, I visited prisons in many parts of the world, every part of the world I've been in, if I've been permitted to. And I find that when I'm talking to people who are inside, one of the first things that people often do is talk about what they did that landed them in prison, because they've been taught to have to narrate who they are in terms of whatever violation they were convicted of, whether they were guilty or not. It always strikes me that it takes some time in those encounters to say, it doesn't matter to me, actually, what you did or did not do before. Let's start from here and think about what kind of world we want to build. And it's amazing to me the ways that is unusual in people's lives to hear that, and both what a relief it is, but also how hard it is to stay in that space that can be opened in that way. And I'm saying that because if we spend too much time trying to sort out who is the proper abolitionist and who should be canceled, we will be distracted. Just as we've been distracted by having 45 in occupying the White House for these years, such that we can barely attend to all of the egregious things that have happened during this time. And we especially have had our focus nationalized, I would argue. It's much harder for me to get people interested in having conversations about what's happening in other parts of the world now. It's much harder for people to have any capacity to focus with the pandemic and with the political situation in the United States on other kinds of questions. But that, too, is part of a problem that I think years of activism have helped me to deal with, in the sense that I know there are always going to be things that are trying to get my attention, and I need to be disciplined about whether or not they get my attention. So I'm sorry that I didn't necessarily answer maybe what you had in mind there, but I do want to say something, though, about what it means to have Black Lives Matter in public spaces. Just as I was speaking earlier about visual culture and how important I think it is in the ways that we all understand issues, it is important for us to have a visual landscape in our public that allows us to feel differently and allows children to begin to see things differently. And I'm, not entirely sure that everyone has the same way of thinking about what these statements mean, or that everyone will be able to understand those statements as they are put in the public square. But I don't think we can devalue the existence of those statements, because I do see the changes that have happened in the last 25 years, from an increasing presence of abolitionists doing their work on small scales in different places, making things, making art, making music, building things, engaging with each other in different ways, and those things also have effects.
Yeah, and thank you for reminding me of the choice I have of where I put my attention and my energy. I do get really distracted, I guess. I'm somehow pulled to puzzles, and also when I see that things are being hidden, or that people think that they're working towards something and it looks like they're not. One thing I didn't mention in Santa Cruz, the ACLU and the NAACP has ongoing meetings with the police chief. And the last 3 years, they have co-sponsored a Martin Luther King Jr. Day and March and Parade, which is great to celebrate that freedom movement and the continuing struggle. What appeared to me as interesting, it grabbed my attention, the police are doing that parade in uniform, wearing guns.
Oh, yes.
So, I don't know. I'd rather not care and continue struggling towards creating new systems for safety and well-being, and say, well, they're doing that and that's weird. And there's so many parts to abolition, where abolition comes from abolishing slavery. And we haven't talked about the interplay of feminism and abolition. And if there's anything we haven't mentioned that's really important to you, I want to make sure you bring that up now, and we can kind of wrap up if you want.
Great, thank you. Well, I'll start with where you ended. I'm really always working from a feminist relationship to abolition, one that has been labeled, I don't even actually know who first used the expression, abolition feminism. And I say I don't necessarily know who did that because I do know something about, for example, the use of the term in Europe where it has a more negative connotation. And I do know the work of someone who gave us an analysis of carceral feminism in which the description allowed us to see the ways in which, for example, the anti-domestic violence movement was contributing to further incarceration. And I know that it's important for me to bring that abolition feminist methodology into everything that I'm saying, which is why I've stressed a few things already in our conversation. One is to again, for maybe the last time, to say that abolition feminism does extend largely from people thinking differently about how to do domestic violence work and how to balance interpersonal harm and state harm, and to think about them simultaneously. So that grounds my relationship to all of these kinds of questions, including questions about the capacity for people to change, including thinking about where we look, and what do I mean by that? One of the things that was often said when I think Angela Davis was doing this work, but also others were doing this work on women in prison in the early 90s. And people would say then, well, why would you be working on women in prison when women in prison are such a small part of the population? And one argument could have been something simple like, well, they're still in prison, but a more profound argument has to do with the way that looking to that which is minoritized can provide a lever toward opening up our thinking at the rest of the structure. So looking at women in prison was a way of looking at the gendering operation of the prison. So how did people get classified? What does classification have to do with the way the prison works? How does classification in prison systems extend into our ways of thinking in ways that we need to be contesting? How does a feminist point of view enliven, reshape the abolitionist questions? And I'm engaged right now in working on a book around these issues with Angela Davis, Meiners and Beth Richie, all of whom in various ways are thinking about these questions with some of the most difficult cases in mind. Cases that involve sexual predators, cases that involve, as I mentioned, domestic violence, and those issues that are often placed at the margin of our thinking in a moment when we talk a lot about mass incarceration and racial capitalism are really important. So I don't want to leave this conversation without saying that everything that I said to you today is informed by a feminist vision, is informed by the kind of feminism that means that we need to always be thinking about how our categories are created. Gender categories are just one of the kinds of categories that we're learning to interrogate differently now. But a feminist way of thinking is always trying to re-examine the ways in which we've narrated structures, ways in which we've segregated one kind of question from another, and those lessons are important to me, and I think really important in the feminist vision that we need to bring forward in the future for abolition.
Something that comes to mind, I don't know if you're familiar with nonviolent communication.
Yes.
Marshall Rosenberg, he went into prisons a lot. And I think also of restorative justice, where these conversations happen with people who have done something harmful, even the
Yes.
worst case scenarios, like you mentioned, like child sexual violence. There's stories of Marshall Rosenberg going into prisons, talking to people who did those things, and the conversations are so profound, and where, you know, tell me why you did this, and the person begins by saying, because I'm dirt. So they've already internalized the idea
Yes.
of who they are and why they should be punished. And it takes some time to have a conversation where they get to a point of, actually, what needs were you trying to meet by doing that? I think I can help you meet those needs without the price that you're paying. And this need must be very strong because you've been in prison now 10 times for that same thing. And it takes a little time, and then it is revealed what the needs are. The needs are separate from the strategies. So let's figure out new strategies to meet those needs. And in very specifically, what that person needed is what everyone needs. They kind of wanted some understanding of what they had experienced as a child when that happened to them.
Yes. Yes. I'm not terribly well informed about nonviolent communication, except in as much as, you know, the generalities. But it's not a practice that I could teach or think deeply about. But I do see that as at the heart of the kind of work that abolitionists are engaged in. And absolutely, this is why it's important for us to recognize that this moment in the streets, which has been really profound and important to me because of the way that it made me understand and see the work that had been done over all of these years, having that visibilized and realizing that it was having this kind of effect was really important. And that's why it's been less important to me to focus on whether or not I think everyone has the same understanding that I have of the issue. The messiness of our being together in public, trying to work this out, is the work that I enjoy, and it is part of the reason why I am a professor and I teach. I like to be with people as they start to move with different kinds of knowledges and toward different material and toward different ideas. As one of my professors, Gayatri Spivak, always talks about, education is the non-coercive rearrangement of desire. And I often quote her to say that that is the kind of work that I'd like to be engaged in. And if we can do that as abolitionists, I think that our work will truly make this a better world.